Hello, and welcome back to a new episode of For Want of a Nail. As always, I am Robin, your host, and I am joined today by my co-host,
Kat.
Thank you very much. Kat's an old friend of mine from college. Kat, would you like to give us a little bit of idea of your bona fides, historically speaking?
Historically speaking, I'm Kat. Pronouns are any pronouns. And I currently live in Los Angeles with my girlfriend. I'm an engineer, and I went to NYU with Robin and the whole gang of people. Yeah.
But you have no actual, historical training per se. You're not a historian in
No. My father was a history teacher, but he did not pass that gene down to me.
Okay. That's unfortunate. We could always use more history teachers, but that's not true. There's plenty as there are. But this just wanted to keep in line with the sort of theme of this show, which is that I bring on engineers to talk about history. So simply because that's all of my friends. So tonight I've told you already what topic we're going to be discussing. So I don't know if you've done any research since I told you about it.
I did not.
Okay, but tonight we will be discussing the White Night Riots. Before we get to that, we have to talk about someone else. And that man's name is Daniel Sickles, better known as Dan. But Daniel Edgar Sickles was born in New York City, the son of a patent lawyer and politician, and he was born in 1819, we think. We're not exactly sure, because he frequently lied about both his year of birth and his age for reasons that will become apparent later.
Interesting.
Yes, he learned to be a printer and attended the University of the City of New York, which is now NYU.
We love an NYU man.
You gotta give it up for alumni pride, you know? What was our mascot? The Fighting Violets?
Ah, yes. The most threatening of all mascots.
I know, of course. Obviously. I look at the color purple and my blood runs cold.
I scream.
Dan apprenticed under the attorney Benjamin Butler. No, not the one from the Civil War, the other one, the future U.S. Attorney General, and became a lawyer in 1846. And in 1847, he was elected as a member of the New York State Assembly, meaning he was only 28 when he entered the New York State House.
Is that young?
Oh, I know that you're a small child at the age of 22. But I am currently 25, and I will say that I can't imagine being in any elected office within the next 3 years.
Fair enough.
So I would say that's pretty young.
Fair enough.
In 1852, Dan married Teresa Bagioli. Neither his family nor her family approved of the pairing, though, as Sickles was 32 at the time. Real quick, I want you to guess how old Teresa was.
16?
Wow. You are surprisingly close, which is depressing. She was 15.
I was going to guess that, but I was like, that's too creepy.
Yeah. You know, with a question like that, the answer is never going to be like 33 or 30.
Yeah, I was hoping it would be like she was just like 60 years old and he was just really into older women, but
that makes sense.
Unfortunately, I was let down.
Yes. Though the account of this, account of his life I was reading did take pains to point out that she was reportedly mature for her age and spoke 5 languages, as though that makes it okay.
Oh yes, every language you speak adds another year to your life. Legally, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. After the 4th language, the age of consent gets lowered.
Yeah.
And it's a weird loophole. I don't know why they kept that. Though, despite the age difference, the pair supposedly did indeed love each other quite a bit. Though this did not stop Dan from philandering. He kept regular company at New York's many brothels and would carry on long relationships with various prostitutes. In 1853, Sickles was appointed Secretary of the U.S. Legation in London under then-diplomat James Buchanan by President Franklin Pierce, which is a lot of legalese to say he was basically there to help out the ambassador to the UK, who at the time was James Buchanan.
He became a president, right?
James Buchanan would later become president.
Okay, good.
You actually remembered something about history, which is interesting. That's one of the first times that's happened on this show. Dan had recently been censured by the New York State Assembly for bringing a prostitute named Fanny White into the Assembly chambers.
That can't be the first time that happened.
I'm sure it was. Given the fact that he was just basically slapped on the wrist, and then he got appointed to go hang out in Britain for a while with an ambassador, means that this probably was a fairly frequent occurrence. But it also is kind of weird. Like, if I'm cheating on my wife with a prostitute, I'm not going to bring her to work.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't.
Yeah. But when it came time to leave for England, Dan left his 16-year-old pregnant wife at home and took Fanny to London. Interesting. I know that the Brits use Fanny to mean something, and so it is kind of funny to take the phrase that you took Fanny to London. But do you know what the British use Fanny to mean?
Yeah, when I went to London, we were told explicitly not to call our fanny packs because we will get laughed at. Instead, they're bum bags, which, in my opinion, is funnier, but to the Brits, it's not.
I love, every time I go traveling, I always forget something, and I don't realize it until I get there. But I'm always doing this sort of mental math in my head during the trip of like, okay, what did I forget this time? Was my shoes? And I just like to picture him on the boat to London, where he's just like patting his pockets like, okay, I got my keys, I got my wallet, I got my glasses, I've got the prostitute, I must be forgetting something. And then he just slaps his head like, my wife.
Why did he leave his wife?
She was pregnant. I think she didn't want to make the trip.
Fair enough.
And she was 16 years old, which, I mean, God, it's really creepy to say that. I gotta say, the 1800s was a bad time. Yeah. It was just a really bad time. While in London, Dan caused a minor diplomatic incident when he brought Fanny to a party at the palace and introduced her to Queen Victoria, stating she was the daughter of a political opponent back home.
He really didn't learn from his slap on the wrist. He really had to take it a step further.
The papers were aghast with stories that Fanny had curtsied at the Queen.
Is that bad?
That's to Victorian era England. This is Queen Victoria. So to Victorian era England, the idea of someone introducing a prostitute to the Queen was unheard of. It'd be like today if President Biden shook hands with a porn star.
I would love to see that.
I would love to see that, but you know that like
but the press would have
the press is going to have a problem with it. Yeah, exactly. The story goes that they were at a dinner, and Queen Victoria was going down the line, basically shaking hands with everyone. And at the last second, somebody from someone from the assembly, from the ambassadors group, grabbed Fanny and pulled her out of line just in time for her not to shake hands with the Queen. And also, Dan didn't endear himself to the Brits because at one point they held a feast for the ambassador on the anniversary on July 4th. But Dan was so offended at spending time in the UK on July 4th and going to a Brit party in the UK that he refused to he was a big child and just sat in the corner sulking the whole time. And when they rose to give a toast, at the end of the night, he pointedly remained seated and I believe turned to look at a portrait of George Washington, which had been hung behind the table instead of looking at anyone else.
He might as well have just thrown their tea into the river.
That would have been quite the baller move at this point to go to London and be like, you remember the Boston Tea Party? Well, here's the London Tea Party. He returned home and in 1857 was elected to Congress. Teresa, because that's the next step, logically, in someone's political career, is you've caused a minor diplomatic incident and you've been censured back home. Let's send him to Washington. Teresa and Dan moved to Washington, D.C. and took up residence only a few blocks from the White House because their old friend, James Buchanan, had recently been elected president and considered himself to be a good pal. Dan would spend most of his time either in Congress or a brothel, and as such, Teresa began to grow lonely. And she caught the eye of a young attorney named Philip Barton Key II, who was, if you might recognize the surname, it's a very strong name. It's a very Oscar Wilde-esque name of, like, I just picture like an old dandy fop or something like that. And do you recognize? You might recognize the surname on that. Key.
Barton?
Do you remember?
Key.
Philip Barton Key II. He was the son of Francis Scott Key.
Oh, yes.
The man who wrote the Star Spangled Banner.
A lot of patriotism. Strong patriotism in the story.
Yes. Well, given how at this point the United States was like just barely over 50 years old, most of the people who were like really important are like their kids are still around. And not even like that old either. Like they're pretty, like they're basically the people in charge right now. So
makes sense.
Yes. So Barton and Teresa pick up a relationship, but it was soon discovered by friends who reported the infidelity to Dan. And when Dan confronted Teresa, she confessed and revealed the signaling system that Philip used to check if she was alone. And the very next day, Philip arrived out front of the Sickles home and, unaware that Dan was hot to the game, gave the signal. Which I believe, if I remember correctly, that he would sit at a bench across the street from their house, and then he would just take his handkerchief out of his breast pocket and just set it on the bench next to him. I think, which was like his signal, like, "Are you alone? And if you are, I'm available."
Wow, so classy.
Yeah, I think people had to be more classy back then. You couldn't just text somebody. Then you had to come up with some weird semaphore using handkerchiefs. Dan noticed the signal, though, and came bursting out of the house with a loaded gun and chased Philip to Lafayette Square, the park across the street from the White House, where he shot him dead on the street.
Not so classy.
Not so classy. A little bit less classy. He immediately turned himself in for murder, though, and was arrested. There are reports that members of staff at the White House heard the shots.
It's like the last place you want to commit murder is right in front of, like, the heads of the government.
Yeah, I mean, of course, nowadays it's a lot bigger deal. Like, no one would ever commit a crime in Lafayette Square today because it's probably one of the most watched places in the world. But you got to imagine that at the time, like, this was a time where you could still just walk up to the front door of the White House and knock on it. So, like, security was way more lax back then.
Interesting. I never thought about that.
Yeah, literally there'd never been a president that was shot yet. None of them had been shot. The closest was somebody had shot at Andrew Jackson, but hadn't even hit him, I think. But Dan immediately turned himself in for murder and was arrested, but he received so many prominent visitors while in jail that he was allowed use of the head jailer's apartment to receive them. President Buchanan even sent Sickles a personal note. That's crazy. The idea of somebody murdering somebody on the steps of the White House, and then so many people show up to see him that he kicks the warden out of his house so he can use that.
Yeah, the warden, like, live at the jail?
Yeah, at the time, generally, like, you would be, the head jailer was basically, like, the lead guard, and so part of the job would generally be you'd be given room and board.
Interesting.
Yeah. Dan pulled every political favor he could to get out of it and hired Edward Stanton, among others, as a defense attorney. Do you recognize Edward Stanton?
No.
He was a prominent politician. He would later become a member of Abraham Lincoln's cabinet.
Interesting.
Yes. I think. Oh, I hope I got that right. Let me check real quick. Just want to make sure. He was definitely a member of somebody's cabinet. He was the Secretary of War under... Yes, Lincoln. Oh, thank God. Okay. On the advice of counsel, Sickles decided to attempt a novel legal defense, temporary insanity. The premise being that Dan was so enraged and hurt by the discovery of his wife's infidelity that he was driven temporarily insane. Basically saying, I wasn't crazy before or after the murder, but I was during, so I shouldn't have to go to jail. Yeah. It's not great.
They don't do that anymore, do they?
We'll get into it.
All right.
Don't worry. There's a reason there's a reason I'm talking about this. Outside the courtroom, newspapers praised Sickles for saving all the ladies of Washington from this rogue named Key, and public opinion was overwhelmingly in his favor. The temporary insanity gamble worked, and Dan was acquitted, walking out a free man. Now, his political career was kind of tarnished after that, but not for the reason you think. It was because Sickles forgave his wife her infidelity. It outraged the public far more than the murder ever had, and the pair were forced to retire from public life briefly.
Well, of course. I mean, murder, no biggie, but forgiveness.
Yeah.
The worst.
Like, this, you've forgiven your, at this point, must be only 20-year-old wife of her infidelity after murdering her lover in cold blood on the street. I mean, that's terrible. But yeah, so they retire from public life. Dan Sickles would go on to do a bunch of other crazy things, which I would like to use for future episodes, so I'm not going to go into them now. So we'll leave him alone. But if you're interested to learn more about the life of Dan Sickles, it's insane. We'll talk about him later. But for now, we have to jump forward quite a bit to a certain Harvey Milk. Are you familiar with that name?
Only because you said it the other day.
Okay, wonderful. Harvey Bernard Milk was born in New York City, sensing a theme, on May 22nd, 1930, to Lithuanian Jewish parents that had helped to organize the first synagogue in their neighborhood.
Cool.
Growing up, Harvey was teased for his big ears, nose, and feet, and quickly fell into the rhythms of the class clown. In school, he played football and fell in love with opera. His high school yearbook reads, "Glimpy Milk, and they say women are never at a loss for words," which is just great. You know, you just love the casual sexism of the 1950s. In college, he attended SUNY Albany, a State University of New York, Albany. Harvey majored in mathematics and wrote for the school newspaper. A classmate later said, "He was never thought of as a possible queer. That's why you never called what you called them then. He was a man's man." After college, Milk joined the Navy and served during the Korean War. Which is actually also becoming a bit of a theme to these episodes, I've noticed. There's a lot of Navy men who have shown up in these for one of the Nail episodes. I might have to look into that. After being discharged in 1955, Milk would spend the next 18 years bouncing between jobs and roaming around the country. At one point, he struck up a relationship with Craig Rodwell. He was very passionate towards Rodwell, but disapproved of his involvement with the Mattachine Society, a gay rights organization. In 1964, he even worked for the Barry Goldwater presidential campaign, though over time his conservatism would fade, and eventually Milk settled in the Castro neighborhood of San Francisco. Are you familiar at all with Barry Goldwater?
No, I have no idea who he is, other than presidential candidate, apparently.
Yes. He was a Republican presidential candidate in 1964 who was famous for one of the worst electoral defeats in U.S. history. He was very conservative, very strong libertarian. I think his most famous quote is that he said, what was it? "Extremism in the name of liberty is no vice." And basically he was known, like a lot of people were afraid that if he became president, he'd start a nuclear war. So,
who did he beat?
He lost. He lost to Lyndon Baines Johnson, who turned around and got us even deeper involved in Vietnam as repayment for winning the election.
Well, at least it wasn't nukes.
Yes, but we did get the Voting Rights Act of 1965 out of it, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I believe.
So, relatively good things.
Yeah, not all bad. You win some, you lose some, you know? In 1973, Milk ran for city supervisor and found that he had a natural talent as a politician. He ran a surprisingly strong campaign for a newcomer by appealing to gays that were fed up with the inaction and compromise of the more established gay political organizations. He swept the Castro, but failed to win any seats. Win a seat on the supervisor council. At the time, I don't know if San Francisco still does it this way, but they had a weird system where basically there were a certain number of seats for city supervisors, and the way you got on it was that every candidate would just run all at once. So often there'd be like 20-something candidates, but the top 5 or top 6 or 7 or however many there were candidates would get seats regardless of where they came from.
Gotcha.
So Milk would win. So you could very easily get into like the top 10, but not get a seat. That kind of thing. In response to his defeat, Milk began building relationships with local unions and organizing gay-owned businesses in the Castro. And soon he earned himself the unofficial title, the Mayor of Castro Street. At this time, San Francisco probably had the largest gay population in the United States. Started out with, after the Korean War, gay men who had been in the Navy that were serving, who had been discovered, were kicked out. And many of them were or even those that had been serving and then the war ended, they would just end up sticking around in San Francisco, which was usually where they were dropped off. Because oftentimes if they were outed as being gay, they wouldn't have a family to return to. In 1975, Milk ran for supervisor again and formed a close working relationship with mayoral candidate George Moscone. I hope that's how you spell it. You pronounce it. I'm not going to apologize. I'm not going to apologize too much. But yeah, it's a difficult name. I'm going to say Moscone. Milk came up just short of winning a supervisor position, but Moscone won the mayorship and recognized the help Milk had given him with the city's gay community. That year, a local gay man, Oliver Sipple, saved President Gerald Ford from an assassination attempt when he was in San Francisco. Sipple had been a lover of one of Milk's former partners, and sensing an opportunity to get a positive national story about a gay man, Milk leaked the fact that Sipple was gay to the press. Sipple was not out at the time. In the reporting of Sipple and his sexuality, Milk was often mentioned as well as a leader of the San Francisco gay community, and Sipple's mother was a conservative Baptist and refused to speak to him for the rest of his life after he was outed. That's
not what you want to do.
Yeah, it's kind of fucked up, right?
Yeah, more than kind of, yeah.
Yeah, it's real bad. In 1976, Milk ran for the California State Assembly. His campaign was passionate but disorganized, much like the man himself, and Milk was often described as manic. Like many politicians in San Francisco, Milk took advantage of volunteers from the People's Temple and even secured the endorsement of the church's enigmatic leader, Jim Jones. Do you recognize that name at all?
Nope.
Jones also endorsed Milk's opponent, to which Milk said, well, fuck him. Which is kind of good. I'll mention this again later, but Jim Jones and the People's Temple was a cult that as soon after 1976 would sort of get chased out of California because of Jones' continuing clashes with the federal government. And they ended up building a compound in Guyana, in South America, where a few years later, a congressman would come to visit to sort of check things out because family members of the cult, people in the cult were getting concerned. Congressman Leo Ryan. And he came, he showed up. It didn't go well and ended with the congressman being killed and almost everyone in the cult committing suicide.
Was that the Kool-Aid? Yes,
that's where the phrase "Don't drink the Kool-Aid" comes from.
Okay.
Yeah, because that's how they did it. They did cyanide laced. It was actually Flavor Aid, but cyanide laced Flavor Aid. And it's actually, I think, currently still. I don't know if it's still, but at the time, it was the first time a sitting congressman had ever been killed. Yeah. But Jim Jones was a very strong political force in San Francisco at this time, and pretty much everyone took advantage of his volunteers because the members of the People's Temple were enthusiastic. You didn't have to pay them, and they would work odd hours.
That's why we love cults.
Yeah, it's great. But despite this, Milk lost the race by a mere 4,000 votes. At this time, national politics were turning against homosexuals. That year, the Florida Citrus Commission had successfully overturned an ordinance in Miami that made discrimination based on sexual orientation illegal by ballot measure.
The Florida Citrus Committee?
Yep.
The people with the oranges?
Literally the orange juice people, yeah.
All right.
Literally the orange juice people. There's a reason that if you talk to some older homosexuals, they refuse to drink, like, Florida's own orange juice. But the campaign used the name Save Our Children, just in case you thought these people ever changed their messaging. Conservative politicians across the country were realizing that discriminating against homosexuals could get them votes. And if there's anything a conservative will do, it will be shit on a minority group in order to gain votes.
That's true.
Yes. In 1977, Milk tried for city supervisor one last time. He ran on a populist philosophy summarized, "We don't want sympathetic liberals. We want gays to represent gays. I represent the gay people, street people, the 14-year-old runaway from San Antonio. We have to make up for hundreds of years of persecution. We have to give hope to that poor runaway kid from San Antonio. They go to the bars because churches are hostile. They need hope. They need a piece of the pie."
Seems like a pretty good campaign.
Yeah, I mean, as much as the whole outing of Sipple and the usage of the Jonestown people, but that's not really, like, he had no idea where that was going. There is an element of him that, like, I read that as somebody who's queer in the modern day, and it does feel inspiring in some level, you know?
Yeah.
But Milk won by 30% within a field of 16 candidates.
Third time's the charm.
Which is insane. Yeah. But to win by 30% with 15 other people on the ballot, that's crazy. Yeah. He was at the height of his political popularity, but his notoriety was beginning to earn him death threats. He recorded himself saying, "If a bullet should enter my brain, let that bullet destroy every closet door." Which is a great fucking line.
That is a great fucking line.
I love that line. That's awesome. Anyways, sorry. Milk was now the first non-incumbent openly gay man to win an election for public office in the United States.
Was there an incumbent openly gay man?
Yeah, there were that had happened before. I think once or twice. I can't remember the names, but basically where somebody already in office came out as gay and then won their re-election.
Gotcha.
But elected alongside Harvey were a few other political newcomers, including Carol Ruth Silver, Gordon Lau, Ella Hill Hutch, and former politician and firefighter Daniel White. Milk quickly made an enemy of White, repeatedly voting against issues important to White that Milk disagreed with. Milk introduced a civil rights bill that outlawed discrimination based on sexual orientation. It passed unanimously except for Daniel White, who had made it a point to always vote against Milk. Milk also campaigned furiously against a ballot initiative in California called the Briggs Initiative that would have required that known homosexuals or known supporters of gay rights working in public schools be fired. Basically saying that a gay man couldn't teach in a public school.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah. It's because it's, once again, save the children. Won't somebody think of the children?
Yeah, I mean, we know that, homosexuality makes you a terrible teacher.
Yeah. Like, I know little Billy over there is going to grow up to be the perfect little wasp until the moment he saw that Mr. Richards in third period was a gay man, and now he's OD'd on drugs. So, are you happy, homosexuals?
Yeah, I mean, that's why Miss Frizzle is the worst teacher.
Miss Frizzle is the ultimate queer icon.
It's true.
I will argue. I will fight anyone who says different. The proposition, though, lost by more than 1 million votes and was a major victory for the gay community at a time when bigotry seemed to be gaining ground around the country. 3 days after the proposition vote, Dan White resigned from his position as supervisor, claiming his salary was too small to support his family. Only a few days after that, though, White changed his mind and asked Moscone to reinstate him. Initially amenable, the other supervisors talked Moscone into appointing a new candidate instead that would align more with the city's increasingly liberal and diverse population. A half hour before the conference to announce White's replacement, Dan White snuck into City Hall through a basement window and confronted Moscone in his office. They were heard arguing and then gunshots. White left Moscone's office and headed to his old one, where he reloaded his revolver. White then bumped into Milk in the hallway and asked him to step into a side room. Once inside, White shot Harvey 5 times, including twice in the head. Dianne Feinstein, current head of the city supervisors, heard the shots and called the police. White turned himself into authorities later that night. Newspapers were splattered with the news of the tragedy, coming only days after the mass suicide of the People's Temple in Guyana.
Oh, man.
Yeah, no, this was a really rough back-to-back news day for the people of San Francisco. Largely because most of the people in Guyana were from San Francisco. Because, like, Jim Jones didn't really have a national reach. He was just popular in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people were in the city were touched by that tragedy. And then a very popular two members of local government, including the mayor, were assassinated.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it's huge. White's arrest and trial inflamed tensions between San Francisco's deeply conservative police force and the increasingly liberal populace. Many officers publicly wore shirts emblazoned with "Free Dan White." An undersheriff later said, "The more I observed what went on at the jail, the more I began to stop seeing what Dan White did as the act of an individual and began to see it as a political act and a political movement." Basically saying that he had the full support of the police department.
The police are always supporting the whites.
That's awful, but it's true, and I hate to support it in any way, but yeah, God damn it. In the courtroom, all gay and ethnic minorities were excluded from the jury pool, leaving it predominantly white and Catholic, two groups that are notoriously receptive to the LGBT community.
Yes.
Yes. White's lawyer argued for diminished capacity, saying that the machinations of political opponents in City Hall had pushed Dan White to the edge, and his junk food binge on the day before the murder exacerbated this spiral. This became known as the Twinkie Defense. It is a variation on the original temporary insanity, basically saying that Dan White was a man on the edge, and then he ate a bunch of junk food, and that caused him to lose all sense of right and wrong.
Did it work?
White was acquitted of first-degree murder and was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 7 2/3 years, but could be out in as little as 5.
What's the difference between voluntary manslaughter and murder? I thought manslaughter was just involuntary murder.
Manslaughter implies that there wasn't like malicious. It wasn't like you were setting out to murder somebody. Like if you get caught up in the moment and a fit of anger, that's murder. Like if you take actions to try to that you knowingly will cause the death of somebody, that's murder. Manslaughter is like you set in motion the events that cause people to die. Whether that is as obvious as like I drove with my eyes closed or something, or something as crazy as like, or something as far apart as like, oh, I built this roof wrong and then 20 years later it collapsed. Like that could be manslaughter. So the big part is that it comes with a way lower prison term.
Gotcha.
Manslaughter. Voluntary means that you did something that you knew was dangerous, but not something that you necessarily knew was going to result in murder.
So they
or death.
So they said that he shot this guy in the head twice and overall 5 times, but he didn't know it was going to kill him.
I think what they argued was they agreed with the Twinkie defense, which was that they didn't think White went. They thought White was going in there basically as a crazy man, and that he didn't go in there with the intention of murdering the mayor and Harvey Milk. He went in there with the intention of arguing for his job back and brought his service pistol along. Or not a service pistol, a pistol along. And then he was so crazed that when things didn't go his way, he responded violently. But basically they let him off with a slap on the wrist. Like, there's really no way to look at it logically.
Gotcha.
When the verdict was announced, a cop sang Danny Boy over this police radio. Thousands of protesters turned out to City Hall that night to let out their rage at the injustice of the verdict. They set fire to cop cars and City Hall itself. When a reporter asked a rioter why they were doing this, they responded, "Just tell people that we ate too many Twinkies. That's why this is happening." Which is, this story's been filled with a bunch of great lines. Later that evening, several police cruisers filled with officers wearing riot gear arrived at the Elephant Walk Bar on Castro Street. Harvey Milk's protege, Cleve Jones, and a reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle, Warren Hinkle, watched as officers stormed into the bar and began to beat patrons at random. After a 15-minute melee, they left the bar and struck out at people walking along the street. I think that's a good point to just drop a good old-fashioned ACAB. But Dan White served 5 years for the murders and was released from prison in 1984. On October 21st, 1985, Daniel White committed suicide in his garage.
Wait, so how long was it?
1 year. He had 1 more year of freedom after he got out, and then after he was released, he basically destroyed his career, his public persona, and his marriage. His family, they were gone to him. So he didn't really have anything else when he got out. This is sorry to end on a really downer note there. But yeah, that's how Dan Sickles' use of the temporary insanity plea led to the White Night Riots and an outpouring of queer rage across San Francisco.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's pretty crazy.
And you asked earlier if temporary insanity is still around. And luckily, it has largely been gotten rid of as a political defense. Though there are still instances where it is allowed. Most notably, I don't know if they still have it on the books, but I think up until recently, Texas had a law that if you found a man in bed with your wife, you were allowed to kill him.
Yes. Good old Texas.
Yes, and some states, I don't know which ones, but I believe some states still have, still allow the use of what is called the trans panic defense.
I've heard of that.
Yes, for those at home who have, would you like to explain it to the audience for those at home?
No, you go for it.
Okay, cool. The idea being that if somebody is suddenly realizes that someone else is transgender, then it would be understandable that they would be so enraged by this discovery that they would have no other alternative but to murder this person. It's not a law, but it is in some states it is still considered a valid legal argument.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. I love that. Just love it. Like I said, sorry to end on a downer note. But any sort of concluding remarks you'd like to leave us off with?
Be gay, do crime.
Be gay, do. That's the best send off anyone's had so far. I gotta say, I love it. Be gay, do crime, everyone. Thank you very much.